Well, the Prime Minister has already announced 5 projects that are going to be potentially fast-tracked through this major projects office. And tomorrow in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, he's expected to announce the second tranche of projects. This is something he promised to do before the Grey Cup, which is this weekend. So as you pointed out in that graphic, we've learned through sources about 4 of the projects he's expected to talk about tomorrow. One of them is a mine for critical minerals just north of Timmins. There's also another mine in New Brunswick. There's a hydroelectric dam in Iqaluit, as well as the Sil Isms LNG export terminal in British Columbia. So these are the 4 projects. Sort of what does this all mean? What's the goal here? Well, the Major Projects Office was set up in August with the goal of streamlining the regulatory and approval process by highlighting certain projects and being able to bring together experts, bring together a regulatory process through one kind of point person, one point office, and take these projects and move them along. And so the goal is really, once a project has been deemed in the national interest, which is something that Cabinet has to do, that you get a decision within 2 years.
Canada is building something the world has never seen before. Deep beneath the flatlands of Saskatchewan, a $14 billion megamine is taking shape, one that will control roughly 10% of the entire global potash supply. And here is the part that changes everything. The United States gets nearly 90% of this critical farming ingredient from Canada. So what happens when you start a trade war with the country that feeds your farmers? One of the world's largest mining companies recently confirmed that the first stage of its Jansen potash mine in Saskatchewan, Canada, is now 75% complete. First production is on track for mid-2027. The total investment across both approved stages stands at 14 billion Canadian dollars. This is not a routine mining announcement. Jansen is the largest private investment in Saskatchewan's history. It is also the single largest investment BH has ever made as a company. When both stages reach full capacity, the mine will produce 8.5 million tonnes of potash every year. That represents roughly 10% of everything produced globally. The mine is designed to operate for 100 years. Nothing built anywhere in the world compares to this in scale, in duration, or in consequence for the global food supply. The numbers behind this project are difficult to ignore. Stage 1 was initially approved at 7.5 billion Canadian dollars. By January 2026, that figure had been revised to 8.4 billion US dollars after updated construction reviews. Stage 2 was approved in October 2023 at an additional 6.4 billion Canadian dollars. Saskatchewan sits on approximately half of the world's total potash reserves. Canada's unmined reserves stand at 1.1 billion tonnes. The Jansen deposit alone carries a measured resource of 5.17 billion tonnes. Global annual consumption currently sits below 40 million metric tonnes. That means a single Canadian province holds reserves that exceed a full century of global demand at current consumption rates. Canada produced 15 million metric tonnes of potash in 2024, roughly 1/3 of everything mined globally that year. In 2023, Canada accounted for over 41% of global potash exports, shipping to the United States, Brazil, and China. But the real story is just beginning. Potash is a naturally occurring mineral containing potassium. It is one of 3 essential nutrients alongside nitrogen and phosphorus that soil loses faster than it can recover on its own. Without continuous application, crop yields fall, harvests shrink, and food prices rise. Nitrogen fertilizers supported by potash inputs are estimated to sustain roughly half of the global human population. Canada has long dominated this market. All of Canada's active potash mines are located in Saskatchewan. No other jurisdiction on Earth has this concentration of supply in a single province. The geopolitical picture shifted further after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russia and Belarus together produce between 37 and 40% of global potash. When sanctions and trade restrictions cut off much of that supply, global buyers turned to Canada. Canadian producer Nutrien responded by boosting its potash output by 40% between 2020 and 2025. This is where the situation directly affects American farmers and eventually American families at the grocery store. US farmers consume approximately 5.3 million metric tons of potash every year. American domestic production stands at only around 400,000 metric tons annually. The gap of nearly 5 million tons is filled almost entirely by Canadian supply. In 2024, 79% of all US potash imports came from Canada. When the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports in early 2025, starting at 25% before being reduced to 10%, the consequences were immediate. The US import price index for chemical fertilizers rose from 164.5 in December 2024 to 186.5 by September 2025. Fertilizer costs became the primary driver of rising expenses for US crop farmers, climbing 11% in that period. Fertilizer accounts for 45% of operating costs for American corn farmers. Facing a third consecutive year of declining corn prices, those farmers had no room to absorb additional costs, and this is where the situation becomes more complicated. In December 2025, the Trump administration quietly struck a separate deal with the Belarusian government. Washington agreed to release 123 political prisoners held by Belarus in exchange for lifting sanctions on Belarusian potash exports. The move signaled something important. The United States was actively searching for an alternative to Canadian supply. But transportation costs from Belarus and Russia remained substantially higher than the existing Canadian rail routes that crossed directly into American distribution points. What this situation reveals goes well beyond a trade dispute. It exposes a structural dependency that tariffs cannot fix, and that no domestic US production timeline can resolve in the near term. The Fertilizer Institute stated plainly that the United States does not have sufficient domestic potash reserves to meet demand regardless of any effort to stimulate domestic production through tariffs. Building a new mine from scratch in the United States would take between 10 and 15 years. Spring planting operates on a weeks-long window, not a decade-long construction timeline. Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer at StoneX, framed the alternative clearly. If the US moves away from Canadian supply, the next largest option is Russia. That is not a politically stable or logistically competitive replacement. Meanwhile, Canada is not standing still. The Jansen mine adds an entirely new production layer on top of an already dominant base. At full capacity, it will produce more potash than the combined annual output of several mid-tier producing nations. Future phases carry the potential for 16 to 17 million tons per year from a single site, nearly half of current global consumption. Ottawa has also demonstrated it understands its leverage. Canadian politicians raised the possibility of restricting or taxing potash exports during the 2025 tariff standoff. No restriction was imposed, but the conversation alone was enough to make Washington take notice. The Jansen mine is not simply a construction project. It is a century-long commitment that locks Saskatchewan's agricultural leverage into the global food system for generations. Oil controls energy. Fertilizer controls food. And the arithmetic of who controls what and for how long is being settled in the ground beneath a Canadian province that most Americans cannot find on a map. Trump started a trade war, but the country on the other side of that war holds half the world's potash, and the mine is not even open yet.